Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vic Chow, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Sony exhibit here at CES. Everywhere you look this year, you'll find exciting new innovations from Sony. And whether you're in our visual entertainment or music entertainment areas, or visiting our digital imaging or PlayStation displays, all of these innovations will provide you with an incredible user experience. Because, as a fully integrated company, only Sony is capable of delivering the ultimate in entertainment, the same way the creators intended. And when it comes to digital imaging, the Sony Artisan of Imagery program features some of the most creative and respected professional photographers from around the world. Each has their own unique style and vision, but they all have one thing in common. They create their work using a Sony Alpha camera. Benjamin Lowy is an award-winning American photojournalist who's best known for his work as a conflict photographer in the war zones. He received a BFA from Washington University in 2002 and began his career in 2003 covering the Iraq War. Since then, he's covered major stories worldwide, and his work has been featured in several exhibits and museums. Ben continues to take a creative journalistic approach when capturing professional sports or the ocean's predators, using both underwater photography and video. Please welcome Benjamin Lowy.
Thank you. Again, great introduction. It's probably the last one of the year. At least the power didn't go out this time. Yeah, which was nice. Thanks, everyone. My name is Ben Lowy. I am many things. For about 10 years, 12 years, I worked in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Darfur. I was in Benghazi, kind of all the world's hotspots. And this was a lot of the work I did day in and day out for many, many years. And there were a couple of things that happened that kind of took me on the road of trying to be more creative with my approach to storytelling. One of them was my anger at coming back to the US or going anywhere where people were like living their lives, as we all do, in relative realities. You can't care about everything happening everywhere all at once because each of us have our own problems. And I kind of started seeing that like people didn't care about the imagery that I was bringing back from war zones. Part of the reason is we went in 2003 when I first went to the Iraq War, we were seeing on average about 1,000 images a day. To today where we see close to 6,000 images a day, most of us on our phones or on TV screens or just our interaction with the world. And because there are so many of these images, many of them fall through the cracks. And I tell this story about Nick Ut's image of the little girl covered in napalm from Vietnam. That was one of 12 images that were transmitted back to the US that day using a telefax machine. Magnetic tube that spun with a black and white image, took about 4 hours to send an image back. So newspapers had a very small choice of images to use when they printed. Today, they have tons of images. I worked in Iraq in 2003. I traveled with a small satellite dish, and I would send 50 images back a day, and so did 1,000 other photographers. And so I was trying to figure out how can I talk about all these different war zones that I go to and get people back home to care about it. And what ended up happening was kind of a unique story where I lost my pants. So if anybody knows how the military travels in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in a lot of places where you're taking sensitive equipment around, you get into armored vehicles which do not have a lot of space in it. I actually rode in something called a Rhino, which imagine a city bus covered in about 70 tons of implosive armor, which basically means if a round hits it, it actually explodes outward to remove most of the pressure wave from anyone sitting inside it. And usually it's very tight. It weighs a lot, so when you press the gas pedal on Monday, the bus starts going on Wednesday. And you hang your clothes in a backpack outside the vehicle. And on Airport Road outside of Baghdad, we came under indirect fire, and my backpack with my clothes got blown off the bus. And so I didn't have any pants. And for some reason, I called my mom and said, "Mom, can you go to the Gap and get me a pair of bootcut jeans, because those were in style back then, and FedEx them to Baghdad?" And she said, "Ben," and I love my mom, and she's led me to think about how I do all my work, but this is probably not one of her brightest moments. She said, "Ben, why can't you go to the Baghdad Mall?" I said, "Well, Mom, there's no mall in Baghdad." She said, "I don't know that, Ben, because all I ever see are pictures of explosions and bombs and you going on to raids with armed forces. So I said, you know what, I look like a soldier. I can't go walk out on the street and show you what Baghdad looks like, but the next time I get into a car, I will photograph outside the car window and show you what Iraq looks like. And this actually began a 6-year project of me photographing out of every armored car window that I traveled in Iraq. The square ones are sort of enlisted soldiers, kind of like the older vehicles. And as the years progressed and the armor got better for officers, they became kind of more rectangular windows. And I had no control over what I saw when I made these images, which is a really interesting approach to photography. I couldn't compose anything. I wasn't getting out. I was literally sitting there with my camera and just shooting things as they went by. But this actually became a metaphor for maybe a viewfinder, or for how the West saw the East, or in a way how most soldiers, because you have to realize 70% of military forces are logistics, are not the fighting force. So 70%, this is how 70% of US, British, and coalition soldiers saw Iraq, was through the window of the vehicle they went in. Now, I tried to take that idea of like trying to present a different creative approach to Iraq in another way. I'm combat qualified, so I am allowed to go out with quick reaction forces as a medic, and there's always a night vision goggle that's left over. So when I went out with US Special Forces, I attached a night vision goggle to the front of my camera. And again, trying to present another way of viewing the war. That was what, I still worked for the New York Times and Time Magazine, and I would still present the normal everyday work that people would expect from a war photographer, but I also wanted to try and show it in a different way. But this was my vehicle that I was in Arab Jabor. It's about 20 miles south of Baghdad. And this was 10 years ago. And I just had my last surgery in June to take out like the last piece of shrapnel from my knee. So it actually, it leaves a legacy. And now that I have kids, it's like twofold. Like I told them, when I had kids, and I made this decision when they were really young that I was going to stop doing war photography because I don't remember anything from when I was 5 or 6, so they wouldn't remember me if I died. The problem is that when I tell them this story, the only reason I can still hear was back when I was in Iraq, I used to smoke a ton of cigarettes. And I'm not recommending this to my kids that you should smoke cigarettes, but the only reason that I can hear is because when the bomb went off, I was actually exhaling with a cigarette, and the pressure differential in my ears was the same as the outside. And so when the bomb went off, my actually eardrums did not explode, and everyone else around me did from the concussive wave. The only thing that was interesting is like all my internal organs moved over 2 microns, which is why I've had many surgeries over the time, because it actually causes a lot of damage, the pressure wave. And I just decided, I've done this, now it's time for like me move on. And I wanted to take the lessons that I learned from trying to have a creative approach from doing war photography to the other genres of photography. And interestingly enough, I went back to my hotel after another bombing in 2008. I was covered in blood, and I had just been smuggled out of Kirkuk in the trunk of a car. And I get back to my hotel, and I'm trying to like process what happened in that day, and then the editor from New York Magazine called me and said, "Ben, we want you to come back to New York and shoot fashion for us. We think you've had enough of Iraq, so we want you to like come back and try to bring your sensibilities as being a war photographer to shooting fashion." And of course, when I accepted this, I'm covered in blood. And I just lost like my favorite pair of pants. I remember this. It's like it all comes back to like my pants, like everything that's happened in my career. And when I came back to New York, and literally came off the plane, changed my clothes, put my body armor down, and went to like New York Fashion Week, then went to Paris, Milan, London, and all I wanted to do was make fun of the fashion world. Because I came back from war and I was like, how could people still care about something else? And I had like my own sort of way and approach. A lot of what I was taping my strobe and my flash to my foot, and I was kicking up. I was trying to do like this Karsh moment of underlighting everyone and giving them like super big eyebrows and throwing their shadows everywhere. And I kind of wanted to make fun of it, but at the same time, try and make a different way of viewing fashion. And this sort of led me to doing other stuff in the same idea. I ended up getting assignments to go cover sports. I started doing a lot of Olympics. And the editor that I had at the time was like, "Ben, can you go cover the Olympics and just make art? And can you go try and shoot sports in an artistic way that hasn't been done before?" And so for me, how do you shoot sports? Sports is a lot like war photography. You just have to wait for the moment, and it's peak action. But the thing is, with sports, you're told where to stand. This is where the photographers must be. Whereas in Iraq or Afghanistan, you go to where you think you're not going to get killed. So what I tried to do with my sports photography was whenever I saw a cluster of photographers, I would just try and go someplace else. Now, sometimes that works, and sometimes it doesn't. There's a reason why everyone stands on one side of a ski jump. What I tried to do is I tried to get under the lip of the actual ramp when people go do the ski jump, and all you get are butts floating away from you into the night. That did not make a good image. So there, standing where other people were was probably a better idea. But then sometimes I tried to do different things, shooting through the broadcaster's window, or trying to make an artistic image out of hockey is really hard. Hockey is like the hardest sport to make something artistic out of. So I constantly was trying to figure out how I could approach trying to make a different image of hockey. But sometimes serendipity comes in different ways, and like the photo gods smile down on you. The Sochi Olympics were actually really, really warm, and they were constantly making snow that was melting. So I'm wearing shorts, I have an ice pick, I see all this crowd around me of trying to get the aerial skiers, and I'm climbing up the side of the slope, and because it's melting, I keep on falling into the snow. And snow and ice are getting all over my camera lenses. I'm sweating, I'm wiping the sweat off my face and wiping it on my lenses to try and get the snow off, and all of a sudden it's creating crazy lens flares in all of my images. And I was like, oh, I like this, this is great. Or like, right with this image, and I tell this as a joke, but it's totally true, I am peeing in the porta potties that were photographers. And they're not like, the bathrooms for photographers were basically piss pipes. They didn't treat us very well because they just like, you're the forgotten people. The journalists always are. So it's just like kind of an area off to the side of each venue where you're allowed to go to the bathroom. So I'm just, and it gets crowded, so I'm standing there with my pants around my ankles trying to pee, carrying like 5 different cameras, and I have one with an 800 lens, well, it was like a 400 with a doubler, and I'm up like this, peeing, and I photographed this at the same moment. So my only key for this lesson is like just to be ready even when you're going to the bathroom. After doing the Olympics, I actually got hired because I used to do a lot of fighting sports here in Vegas, to go part of the Save Wrestling campaign, which was when the wrestling, the oldest sport in mankind, got kicked out of the Olympics for a little while. And the Olympic Wrestling Committee sent me to go photograph traditional wrestling techniques all around the world. And part of what we did was we actually wrestled before we actually photographed and wrote about different wrestling techniques. So here I'm in Kolhapur, India, and in order to get into the wrestling temples, I needed to wrestle. So actually the guy on the right, I wrestled him. He was 265 pounds. He was a lot more than me. He's like, you're American. You guys have great protein supplements. You can totally take me. And I don't include the image in this presentation, but I had to wear this loincloth. In fact, I am wearing the loincloth while I'm making this image, which is actually really hard to have a photo pouch with my memory cards attached to the loincloth. The weird thing was that the novice wrestlers, who are about 8 to 10 years old, are responsible for putting the loincloths onto the wrestlers. So there's a slightly awkward moment when I'm standing there completely naked, holding my cameras, and an 8-year-old is like tying me up with the loincloth and making sure that everything is like really secure before I get in there. But once you see a picture of me in a loincloth, you can't unsee it. But just kind of imagine I look vaguely like this, but much paler and hairier. But so again, like after that, the Olympic Committee sent me to go photograph all the world championships of wrestling and the Olympic Games. I was actually responsible for photographing every single wrestler that wrestled. They were not allowed to go back to the locker rooms until I photographed them. And this is actually where, when using one of the technologies that Sony has, which is the eye autofocus, really helped. Because half of these men and women are falling over after their wrestling matches. Like 9 minutes, they're wrestling, they have no rest in the match itself, and they're not allowed to go rest until I photograph them. Now I have a set of different temperature lights hitting them to like bring out the contrast of all like the pores and blood and sweat in their faces. And as soon as they roll by, I'm like taking 10 to 12 pictures really quickly. It's just focusing on their eye before they fall over and leave. But again, going from war photography to this, I still missed doing photojournalism. Like I still, I still go back and forth between wanting to do portraiture or wanting to do fashion or basically, I like doing all aspects of photography because ultimately photography is my ticket to explore the world. I don't have to just do one thing, I can say I can do different things. But I still find the need to go back to do stories that most people don't want to do. I spent a lot of time covering the opioid crisis in America. This is actually a lethal dose of fentanyl, which is 1,000 times more powerful than the lethal dose of heroin. I was in a DEA drug lab in order to do this, and I actually went out with the DEA, I've gone out with police, and this is one of those instances where I don't use the big gear that I use when I shoot sports, but I use a tiny little camera, and I try not to get in the way of the people that I'm with, because I'm usually sitting in the back of a police car, or I'm sitting back of a quick response car. I've actually gone out on stings where they're actually trying to find people, and I'm like the first one there, and part of my images are almost evidentiary and could be used in court because of what I photograph, and the whole idea is I don't want to impact the scene too much. So for me, it's about like trying to stay small and nimble with the work that I do. And you know, that has also taken me to covering politics. And I was on the 2016 campaign, which was kind of amazing. Spent 3 months on Donald Trump's campaign, spent 3 months on Hillary Clinton's campaign, and really got to try my hand again at like, how can you be creative in your approach to shooting politics, which is actually really tough. Like, these are one of the few like strobed images, because when you're in the buffer and you're working with the Secret Service, you're actually really not allowed to use flash. So I have to have a separate camera that has a strobe on it, and I have to wait for just the right moment when the Secret Service is not going to get upset at me. And it's really interesting because one of those things that follows you, when I worked with special forces in Iraq in 2004 and 2007, my biometrics were recorded, and when I report to the White House, they actually know exactly who I am, which is a little bit scary. But again, you know, I really wanted to figure out how I can make my approach to photography and politics a bit more creative. Now, as a bald man, I am really interested in Donald Trump's hair, because I want to think that there's still hope for me somewhere down the line, that when I'm 70, I might be able to pull off having a full head of hair. Maybe there'll be a technology at CES in the next few years that'll allow me to grow my hair back, who knows? But I have thousands of pictures of his hair. I almost feel like I could end up doing a book of just patches of his hair. I don't think it would be a bestseller, but you never know. But again, everything that I did, like with fashion or with sports or with war photography, I tried to bring to the work I did with politics. Taking chances. The day after the inauguration was when there was the Women's March in DC, but people still left the LED panels that were out there for the inauguration up, and I couldn't believe that no one was climbing up them. So I climbed up to make an overall image, and of course the Park Service yelled at me, and I was going to get fined, but I disappeared into the crowd. And this is one other lesson that I have with photography, is I am always of the it's better to say sorry than ask permission, you know, school of thought, where I just do something and then afterwards feign total ignorance. I did not know it was illegal to climb up a 30-foot tall LED screen and, you know, do what I did. But what was interesting to me is about shooting politics is the kind of contradictions that happen, the things that you see when you're covering politics. Now, if anyone knows what the Patriot is, it's a dive bar in New York City that's been around forever, over 100 years, but the entire ceiling is covered with about 40 years worth of bras that women have left behind. Like, the whole ceiling is covered with bras. It's a super horrendous dive bar, but it's really famous and people go there. During the pro-immigrant march in New York, 2 men from Pakistan decided it was time for afternoon prayers, and these 3 women came out to stand next to them to make sure that no one would bother them. And to me, outside of this dive bar, and to me that's like quintessential America, where you have all these different things coming together. And the thing is, I have to explain this image. I know the idea that images are worth 1,000 words, but you need to read the caption to understand what's going on. And that's a disservice to photography. That's a disservice to trying to do what I do, to communicate an idea through just the visual. So ultimately, sometimes photography can fail in its goal. And so what I wanted to do is try and figure out how I could talk about this in a different way. So what I ended up doing when I was on the campaign trail was photograph tight portraits of every American I came across. And the idea being that these weren't Republicans or Democrats, pro-Hillary or pro-Trump or Bernie Brothers or whatever. They were just, the idea was that they were American. And I actually kind of had a cliche approach to it. Like, I tried to find the most Democratic-looking Republican and the most Republican-looking Democrat and let people's own stereotypes and your own, your own biases inside you decide. And on my website, I ended up saying, click here if you think this person is a Democrat or a Republican. Like, you guys make the choice because there is no right or wrong answer. The idea is that they're all American. And so I really wanted to experiment with that. So I originally went to school for comic book drawing. I am actually a failed comic book artist. And I ended up getting into photography because I really sucked at drawing. And I was on a sports team in college, and I used to have all the guys on my team come in and pose nude for me so I could draw them, which is crazy awkward to have everyone on your soccer team come in and be like, dude, can you drop your pants so I can draw you, so I can make you into a superhero? So I just decided, instead of making all my teammates do that, I would just photograph them and then trace the drawings. And that's kind of how I got into photography. But I decided during the campaign that I would go and try and make a comic book out of my photographs. And just because I think it was prescient, this is back in 2016, I decided to use Twitter as my narration. I would go onto Twitter and find the worst things that people would say and use that for the speech bubbles in the comic book. And to me, it's all about the idea of using creativity. What more can I do? How can I take photography to the next level? The thing is, photography is hard. Everyone has a camera now, right? So everyone's photographing it. It's not a business that is great to make a living in, as my accountant tells me very often. And the day rates for photography haven't raised since the 80s, while the cost of living has. So how can I talk about photography and that everyone still can do it and try and remain consistent and have a legacy and do something new? So I started a different project where I'm trying to actually destroy photography. This is my deconstruction of photography, of documentary photography. And I actually discovered this while I was rolling along the street with a stroller, and I actually took too many pictures at the same time. And what I do now is, because if you look up hashtag New York City on Instagram, there are millions of photos. People take millions and millions of photos of New York City. It is, I'd like to say, over-documented. So what can I do to deconstruct over-documentation? Can I create one image of an entire city? And what I started doing was timing how long it took me to walk certain blocks, certain neighborhoods. And I would make, in camera, one picture that represented an entire space. I actually got hired, and I ended up going to the city of Sydney and making one image of the entire city. I would plan to make one image from every street block, and I created a map of how I was going to walk in a grid to create one image as I went. And now I do this all over New York City, and kind of wherever I go. I should probably make one in CES while I'm here, but I don't know if I'll be able to walk through all the venues. I'd have to time that out. But the idea is that I'm trying to take apart documentation by adding more into it. So if I can make one image of, say, I'm walking on Lexington Avenue from 23rd Street to 45th Street, and that's one image. And I call these walkscapes. And so the idea of photography, really, ultimately, is to present a new viewpoint to people in a way that they don't see. So what I tried to do with my walkscapes, with my war photography, is present something beautiful of the way I see it, because that's how we connect to people. I like to call it an aesthetic bridge. It's because I need to create a bridge for you, the viewer, to come in and experience my viewpoint. The best thing about photography is that it is probably the only medium that you can use to make something beautiful out of something horrible. I don't know a single painter or a single sculptor or artist who can try and take something really, really horrible looking and make something beautiful. Picasso tried to do it with Guernica, but ultimately it doesn't really represent the reality of what happened during the Spanish Civil War. It's his feeling of what happened during the Spanish Civil War. So I wanted to take this one step further. During the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and because we have a cliche, all of us grew up during the Exxon Valdez era, we all have this idea in the back of our head of what guys coming out of like, men and women in suits and hazmat suits coming out of like oil-covered water with animals and trying to clean. We all have this idea in our head of what that looks like. So how can I show the story of the oil spill in a more unique way? And so what I ended up doing was just deciding to photograph the oil itself and to make it look beautiful. Beautiful to the point where I wanted people to say, I want to hang this in my living room because it's a beautiful picture, and then contemplate the idea that this is something so horrible for nature, for our environment. These are not aerial photos. These are not taken from a plane or a helicopter. These are taken from my height. And what I ended up doing was sacrificing my leg hair because they would not let me back into port covered in oil, and I would jump into the Gulf and I would shoot straight down into the water. And every day, I know I've told this story 3 times, so it gets old. Every day, I had to clean my boat because we weren't allowed to bring our boat back into port covered in oil. And I used Blue Dawn. Now, we all use Blue Dawn to like clean our dishes. It's the only substance on the planet that can remove oil from organic surfaces. Yellow Dawn doesn't do it, Orange Dawn doesn't do it, even though it smells much better than Blue Dawn. But Blue Dawn is the only substance on the planet that can clean the oil off organic substances. And in fact, during the Gulf crisis, you would not be able to go to any store in America and get Blue Dawn because it was all brought to Louisiana and Mississippi. And I had like 2 little bottles that I bought to clean my boat. And then when I come back into port, the harbor master would throw a razor in to my boat and tell me to shave my legs. So I was allowed to get in there and take all the oil off. But this got me really interested in doing more environmental work. And I guess the idea that I was willing to like grow a 3rd eye because of like being covered in oil and shaving my legs and just doing all these crazy stuff in my lifetime, editors were like, Ben, you can go do other crazy assignments for us in the middle of nowhere. So I started getting hired to do a lot more adventure work, or work that most people turn down. I've done 150-mile solo hikes across Tasmania by myself where I had to film myself filming for the tourism board, which is actually weird because I would set up a camera and then photograph myself photographing myself. But I started getting all these really interesting solo assignments to go around the world and do burly things, whether it was hanging outside of planes and helicopters or swimming with giant animals. This is actually a whale shark, which is the biggest fish in the ocean. They're about 35 to 40 feet long, but their throat is about this big. I always tell people they look just giant that they could swallow you whole, but they actually can't really swallow you. And they also don't have teeth. So I was really into doing these adventure stuff, and the New York Times called me and was like, we have some money left in our fiscal year-end budget, and we know you're trying to do all these different genres. You've done war, you've done fashion, you've done sports, and now you're starting to do adventure stuff, so what do you want to do right now? And I'm the type of person who likes to bite off more than I can chew, and I said, well, let's swim with great white sharks. Why not? I've not scuba dived since I was 15 years old. I know nothing about being underwater or underwater gear or what happens to light underwater or how to float underwater. I actually took a scuba diving refreshing course about 3 hours before I got on the plane to come here. And I'm teaching myself on rental gear how exactly I'm going to shoot sharks underwater. My mom, of course, thinks I'm nuts. So does my therapist. And I just decided I have to live life on the edge and do something interesting. And this was a story that I sold to the New York Times about ecotourism, about how people are actually paying to go be with great white sharks. And the paper was like, well, we kind of need to get the cage in the photograph to show the tourists with the sharks, which basically meant that I couldn't be in the cage with them. So I spoke over a plan with my dive master, and he got a big, giant, frozen piece of tuna, a head, and basically hung it about 5 feet above my head. I had someone else holding my ankles, and the number one thing you're not supposed to do when scuba diving is hold your breath. But of course, I'm holding my breath so I can totally stabilize because I'm not wearing a flotation device. I'm doing this completely out in the open with just about 40 pounds of weight, so I sink. And I'm holding my breath, someone's holding my legs, the tuna is hanging here, and I'm just waiting for this pregnant female shark who's not moving as fast. The difference between sharks is males are smaller, and because they don't have hands, when they want to know what something is, they just bite it. Females are much bigger, don't really like males, get into fights. Shark copulation is like one of the most violent things you've ever seen. Actually, male sharks have 2 penises. As my 7-year-old son likes to say, they have one for good luck. But the fact of the matter is that sharks mating is like the most violent thing that no one's ever seen. We actually haven't seen it, but we think it's really violent because everyone gets bit. And actually really super big female sharks like this one can self-fertilize if they really, really want to, if they just don't want to deal with the males that year, which probably would work out for everyone in the human world too, but it doesn't. So the story of how I made this image was I actually waited for this female shark to come up, and I just exhaled everything, all the air in my body, and just dropped below her as she came up and just took the image, and she went straight for the tuna to eat it. This is actually Persephone. She is the 3rd largest, at 19 feet long, the 3rd largest Pacific great white ever recorded in the Pacific. There might be bigger ones. We just haven't seen them or tagged them yet. This was shot with Sony's 12mm lens. So she's about 5 feet in front of me. Needless to say, one of the things about photography that I love and hate at the same time, and this goes back to my war zone work as well, is that when you're looking through the camera, you're not really there. I'm not really experiencing what I'm seeing. I've seen tons of dead bodies. I've been to mass graves. I've seen friends die in front of me, but I've had the camera up in front of my face. So the emotion of seeing that, of experiencing that, I'm not feeling. When you put the camera down and then you smell the smells and you feel everything, that's when you really experience life. And there's a moment when I'm shooting these sharks where I have to take my camera down and see it. But then there's sometimes when I'm just shooting it when I didn't realize how close I was to being eaten. And that's probably a good thing. And I remember about 2 years ago, I got to photograph the launch of a SpaceX ship from Cape Canaveral, and I never took my eyes off the space shuttle as I was shooting. And so I actually don't think I ever really saw it launch because I was just seeing it through my viewfinder. So even though I'm a photographer and I like to talk about photography and give the good speech, sometimes you just have to experience life too. So the way I'm trying to experience life is to do it with my family. Now, I have kids now, and obviously I'm not taking my 7-year-old to Afghanistan because that would be bad parenting. So instead, I take him to swim with great white sharks with me. I'm not sure if that's bad parenting yet. My kids haven't been eaten. I actually taught my 9-year-old how to scuba dive, and I taught my 7-year-old how to basically equalize. So he can go to about 6 feet right now on air from the surface. And so my 7-year-old is actually in the water with me when I made these images. And I'm kind of like holding on to him to make sure he doesn't get too close, and my camera kind of turned upside down. And when I process this image, it's now forever stuck in my head that when sharks come up to the surface, they look like jokers from a deck of cards. Like medieval jokers. I cannot get this out of my head. So now every time I see a shark, I see like a joker from a card deck in Vegas. But everyone who shoots wildlife shoots it in exactly the same way. Like if you look at National Geographic, it's hard to tell what photographer is shooting that lion and what photographer is shooting that shark. I mean, it's hard to be really creative with wildlife, mostly because you can't interact with them. Now, even though I'm not, as a photojournalist, I'm not supposed to interact with the people I shoot, my presence has an impact. My presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the fashion world, has an impact because people see me there. People see me there and know my camera is taking pictures and react to it. The animals, not really. I mean, they couldn't care less about us. So I'm not gonna say to a shark, can you stop moving and like hold that pose and smile with your eyes, because they don't do that. So what can I do to bring creativity, to try something else out, to have a different approach to wildlife photography? And again, I'm constantly thinking about different approaches. So for me, it's about technology. It's about what can I do to try and make something slightly different. And with the advent of new kind of animations and new ideas of masking together video and stills, I've actually begun creating moving still images with my wildlife. And this works amazingly well underwater, to basically animate the water moving and just have the sharks there. And of course, these aren't printable in the traditional sense of the word, but they can be used online, which is how most of the world experiences images. I'm a magazine photographer, but I don't remember the last time I actually bought a magazine that my work has appeared in. And I have no idea how those kiosks and airports that sell magazines stay open, because no one really buys magazines anymore. So my idea is to try and like create still images that move, so that they can be placed, work in HTML5, work as JPEGs, and still be on websites and still show up and not have the load time that a movie does on your phone or on an iPad or on anything, but you still get a sense of something moving. I wanted to do all these things while at the same time including the one thing that I didn't have in my life, which was I traveled 8 months a year. And I know I talk about my kids a lot, but I like never saw them. The first year of my son's life, or at least when he started talking, he only saw me on a TV screen. We would like FaceTime or we would Skype. And when he used to go out, and he'd see a TV screen in like a Best Buy or a grocery store or whatever, he would call it the Hello Daddy. In fact, he called TV screens the Hello Daddy for 2 years, because that's the only way he knew to see me. And I don't know if that's sad or funny, but I thought, I really need to not do that to my kids. I need to be home. And so what I tried to do was bring them with me. And when I started shooting sea lions in one colony in La Paz for about the last year and a half, they're super friendly. And my idea was, after shooting sharks as predators, I'm going to start shooting the prey. And the thing is, sea lions are not exactly, I mean, they're prey for sharks, but the giant bulls that weigh 2,000 pounds who turn you inside out to eat you, like, they're not something to be trifled with. But I'd play around. This is an incredibly friendly little sea lion who would follow me around for about, he's an adolescent. So this is actually a nursery for sea lions. It's part of an island where just the young ones congregate. I call this one the Karate Kick. But I was basically there almost every day. They got used to seeing me. And I said, I've already taken my son swimming with whale sharks. I've already taken my son, swimming with sea lions. And honestly, my kids are like the most photographed kids. I photograph them all the time. Like, eventually I'll do a book about the stupid things my kids have done. Whenever they go to prom or go on their first date, I'm gonna have the absolute worst pictures of them to show around, like at their wedding. So I said, why can't I start making my career about my family and travel with all of us? My wife, Marvi, is also a Sony Artisan, and we do all our projects together now, and now we take our kids with us. And so I'm going to show this video, which we did for Nat Geo Wild, which is actually a teaser for a new show that we're doing where our kids go out into the world and interview people, and it's sort of Anthony Bourdain meets Sesame Street.
Mom, how big are tiger sharks? Do we kill lemon sharks? Why do people eat sharks? Like, how big are they? Do we kill it for sport on purpose? Have you swam with them?
They ask us all these questions.
And we could talk to them about all the problems.
Global warming, bleached coral,
rising waters,
mass extinction,
pollution.
And it's overwhelming.
It makes me feel sad that people kill animals that are in the sea. People litter in the ocean, killing every single animal.
But when they're in the water, their excitement washes away our despair.
And we hope that with every experience we give them, that they are driven to cherish the ocean, to cherish life, and to be part of the solution. Because this generation, these children,
They are the embodiment of hope.
I wish I was a sea lion. You know that, Dad?
You wish you were a sea lion?
Yeah. They're beautiful.
I agree.
Anyways, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I hope to have hundreds of new Instagram followers at the end of the day. So, thanks a lot, Vic.
Lowy, everybody. Thank you so much, sir.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
That was amazing. He's done that presentation 3 times, and they've all been different, and I've learned different things from him every single time. So thanks so much for keeping it fresh. Thanks so much for sharing with us your great insights about how our Sony Alpha cameras can be used to deliver the creator's intent.